Erev Tov again, everybody. Great to be continuing our learning. And this week for Parashat Chayei Sara, the topic of Ma'arat HaMachpelah, which Rav Meidan has, I think, some comments that hew a little closer to the Pshat than usual for him, and at least one insight that I found really kind of sharp and lovely. And obviously close Eretz Yisrael connection and reading. And in case we don't get to circle back to it, I also want to commend this great book called Makom Parashah by Yoel Elitzur. It's I love books that do sort of one entry or multiple entries on the weekly Parsha that allow you to sort of come at the Torah reading over the course of the year from different angles. I rarely actually go all the way through with them. I often use them more as resources, but they're great things if you're looking for a really fresh take on Parashat Shavua to come from a particular lens. And so this goes through all the Parshiot and picks out a place which is mentioned in that week's Parashah, or a people, and tries to really use historical, archaeological, and other evidence to really get a deeper understanding of the place. So I figured that Ma'arat HaMachpelah would be, the entry for this week's parasha, and sure enough, it was. And interestingly, his reading of the story of Avram's purchase of Ma'arat HaMachpelah is very close to Rav Meidan's. And then he has some more analysis, which I haven't even gotten to yet, including, pilgrims to Israel in the 19th century and their perspectives on what the land was all about. But we'll hopefully at least get a chance to look at one of his insights, one of the debates amongst the commentaries that he points to, maybe if time permits at the end. So here we go. Ma'arat HaMachpelah, Brit Netzach, an eternal covenant, LaMishpacha ve'la'aretz, for the family and for the land. The Torah assigns tremendous importance to the acquisition of the field of Ephron and the cave of Machpelah. It returns and mentions this time and time again. We've got our parasha at the beginning, the field of Ephron, which was in Machpelah before Mamre, the field and the cave that was in it, and all the trees in the field and everything in its border all around, accrued to Abraham as a purchase in the presence of the Hittites, Bnei Chet, for all who were coming into the gates of his city. And the field and the cave that was in it stood for Abraham as a burial acquisition from Bnei Chet. And then later in the parasha, chapter 25, Yitzchak and Yishmael, his sons, referring to Abraham, buried him in the cave of Machpelah in the field of Ephron, the son of Tzochar, the Hittite, which was on the presence of the region of Mamre, the field which Abraham bought from the family of Chet. There, Abraham was buried together with his wife Sara. Then in the end of Breshit in 49, and he commanded them, saying, this is Yaakov, I am being gathered to my people, bury me with my fathers in the cave in the field of Ephron the Hittite, the cave which was in the field of Machpelah in the region, again, presence of Mamre in the land of Canaan, that Abraham bought that field from Ephron the Hittite as a burial grounds or owning. There they buried Abraham and Sarah, his wife. There they buried Yitzchak and Rivka, his wife. And there I buried Leah. This field and cave that were in it as an acquisition from the family of Chet. And then after his death, his children carried him, lifted him up to the land of Canaan and buried him in the cave of the field of Machpelah, which Abraham bought that field as a burial grounds and possession from Ephron the Hittite in the presence of Mamre. Right, so over and over again, we don't just, what Rav Meidan is simply pointing out is it just could have called it Ma'arat HaMachpelah, every time, but it goes through and recaps that this was something which Abraham had bought from Bnei Chet. Also a little discussion that it wasn't just the cave, it was the cave and the field. So the emphasis on the acquisition is extensive. When Abraham comes to bury his dead, Bnei Chet honor him with the title Prince of God. It's possible that he merited this title because of his victory over the four kings, Kedar, Omer, and friends, when he then freed the residents of the land from their subjugation to those kings. Then he was blessed in the presence of, or in relation to, the highest God from Melchizedek, the priest. And according to the Midrash, he was even suggested or offered to take over the rulership of the land. He refused, and we saw this Rav Meidan essay that he's referring to, that Midrash that he quoted there, about sort of this opportunity for taking control of the whole land that Abraham turned down, and what the sort of costs and consequences of that choice were. Sort of a missed opportunity in Rav Meidan's imagination. But in any event, Bnei Chet treat him with real respect. Here, I think Rav Meidan just making the point that Nasi Elokim, Prince of God, is not just a polite honorific. It reminds us of how Abraham really was thought of and what reputation he really had in the land. It wasn't not every sale would be transacted with referring to the buyer that way. And so now when Abraham comes to buy this plot, or I shouldn't say and so, and maybe it's more the opposite. And then, behold, surprisingly, when Abraham comes to buy this burial plot, they politely refuse and suggest to him that, generously, so to speak, that he can bury his dead in the, choicest of their burial spots, but they're not going to sell him a burial ground that would be his. In this counter offer, Bnei Chet want to achieve two goals. First, they want to suggest that they are requesting to be they want to be convinced that Abraham, who is a dignified and kind of nobleman in their midst, won't take hold of land as a fixed permanent holding in their land and then come to be a citizen. Rather, they want him to remain a ger b'toshav, a stranger resident, an alien resident, because he is not from the seed of the land, not from the family of Chet. Second, they want to be sure, or they're interested in the fact that the burial of Sara, choice a plot as they may grant, will sort of find itself embedded in the other graves of the family of Chet, such that Abraham, who will die 38 years hence, will then be buried in some other grave, some other place. And their son Yitzchak, when his day comes, will be buried in some third other place, and so forth. So that there will not be a tradition, a heritage, or a kind of consistency, and so that there will not become an attachment to the place, and so that there will not become some new tribe or some new nation that might threaten, with the passage of time, the Bnei Chet. There's a little echoes of Paro in a sense, right? Not although it's often sort of spoken about as an early kind of anti-Semitism or something like that. And in the face of it, it's a protective instinct for the current residents of the land. Gracious as they may want to be to individuals, they want to foreclose the possibility that this group could become a powerful force in their own right, and so they restrict the opportunities to buy land. In Yoel Elitzor's analysis, he mentions that this was actually, we know this idea in the Torah that permanent sale of the land of Canaan once Am Yisrael comes into to conquer and inherit the land, permanent sale of the land of Canaan becomes prohibited to the Jewish people. And he points out that, that research has shown that that was a common legal reality in the ancient Near East. It was that, for good reasons, people didn't want, they didn't want to sell any part of their tribal lands in perpetuity. So that's what's going on here. Rav Meidan is saying, that, and again, this is the sort of two different ways to read this story. Are they being very, very polite and generous? Or, while trying to be polite, are they firmly rejecting, or are they being generous by offering to give this as a gift? Or in their politeness, are they actually trying to firmly reject the possibility of a territorial acquisition on Abraham's part? And why? But Abraham stubbornly resists, or stubbornly insists, and is not prepared to bury his dead until he buys a burial plot. The covenant which he established with his wife Sara is not only a covenant for shared life, but it's an eternal covenant which continues after death. She mentions, this reminds us of what Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, her mother-in-law. Your nation is my nation and your God is my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. So should God do to me if death would separate between me and you, right? And her intention in that last phrase is, even death will not separate between us. That is to say, we shall be buried together. And so did David wail, eulogize about Shaul and Yehonatan. Shaul and Yehonatan, who were beloved and pleasing in their lifetimes, and even in their deaths, they were not separated. A reference to the fact, as Rav Meidan goes on to say, that they were hanged together in the walls of Beit Shan, and they were buried together underneath the tree, the Eshel tree in Yavesh Gilad. So the first, I was going to summarize what Rav Meidan says it himself in the next sentence, right? So the acquisition of this field of Machpelah at full cost expresses Abraham's faithfulness to his beloved. Following our approach, with those 400 shekel kesef that Abraham buys Machpelah with, he is establishing a second covenant with Sara after her death in the acquisition of the cave, by promising as such that he will be buried by her side, right? It's the contemporary parallel is, when a loved one dies and without burial plots, the surviving spouse will often at that time purchase two plots. I mean, we see this all the time. And that's the commitment to the idea that I'm not just taking the responsibility to bury my beloved spouse now, but I'm also ensuring that I will be buried next to them. Ideally, people have their plots purchased in life and in good health. But when that doesn't happen, it's not uncommon for a person to say, I need a burial plot. Actually, I need two plots. And that's what's happening here with Abraham's acquisition, not of a single grave, but of a burial ground. This is the deep connection, and this is the sharp point of Rav Meidan's that I particularly found interesting. This is the deep connection between the kesef hakidushin, the monetary value of kiddushin, of the betrothal in a marriage, which establishes a covenant in life, and the money of the acquisition of the field, which establishes a covenant even after death. But we spend money on the ring and we spend money on a plot, but there's got to be more than that Rav Meidan is hinting to, and he spells it out here. Indeed, the sages learned the scriptural source for kiddushin being valid by the transfer of monetary value. They learned that from the money which Abraham uses to buy the field of Ephron. And it says here, see Kiddushin 2a. This was really striking to me because I think it's a creative and maybe redemptive and maybe correct reading of this Gemara in the very beginning of Kiddushin, which talks about, in a way that has been read critically in a contemporary feminist lens, the first Mishnah in Kiddushin, Hayisha bishlosha drachim hayisha nikneit, a woman is acquired in one of three ways, and the first one is kesef, through money. That's how we, until today, typically perform Kiddushin, with the transfer of an object of value, that being the ring. That's why you often hear the witnesses, the officiant asking the witnesses under the chuppah, is this an item of value? Has to have some worth and be considered to be kesef in order to effectuate the Kiddushin. And the Gemara there, in proving that Kiddushin is effective through kesef, says, we have a gzeira shava. We learn from the same word used in two places. Kicha kicha mistei Ephron. The language of marriage is ki kachi shisha, when a man takes a wife. And here in the field of Ephron, we also have the language of Avraham acquired the field. And so much of the reading of this is a woman is property, a woman is acquired like ground. And again, I can't say whether that is how the sages were thinking about it or not. But what Rav Meidan is saying, I think in a beautiful kind of redemptive way, is that the commitment in life is actually learned from the sort of commitment in death. That the same way the source for the idea that we make a pledge and consecrate a marriage relationship in life is learned from the commitment that Avraham made to remain with Sara after death. And there's beautiful chazals about Eliyahu Hanavi being at the entrance to the cave of Machpelah and seeing Sara laying in Abraham's arms. And just as an aside, I shared this passage with a couple of rabbinic colleagues, and one of them told me, I have no idea if anyone in this group is a Curb Your Enthusiasm watcher, but apparently there's a little episode or segment in Curb Your Enthusiasm where the main character and his wife are renewing their vows, and she has a comment about in life and in death until eternity. And he says, whoa, I thought we were just committing to stay together in life. Who said anything about the afterlife? I was going to keep my options open for that. And so, in light of that light thought, this is a serious assertion of Abraham's kind of commitment to Sarah. And I think it's a really interesting reading of Rav Meidan. And let me just read a couple more paragraphs, then open up for thoughts before we sort of get to the next segment. So in Parashat Vayera, we noted that the burial of Abraham next to Sarah receives additional meaning because Yishmael joins Yitzchak in the burial of Abraham, right? As in what we quoted earlier when we were listing the litany of places where Marada Machpelah is referenced together with the proof of purchase, so to speak. And there it said, in the end of our parasha, that Yitzchak and Yishmael, Abraham's sons, buried him in Ma'arat Machpelah, etc., etc. That's where Abraham was buried, and there was Abraham buried together with Sarah, his wife. Yishmael, in doing so, in essence, in joining Yitzchak, is recognizing that Sarah, not Hagar and not Keturah, is the eternal partner of Abraham, right? Because, of course, this begs a question. A person might have multiple partners in life. Sometimes the question of alongside which partner are they buried becomes a real question. Hopefully it doesn't have to wind up being a kind of referendum on the most special partner. But sometimes it does relate to that question, the sense of where one eternally rests. And so Yishmael, in joining what Rav Meidan's reading here is that there's a sort of added significance to the meaning of Yishmael showing up. Again, this is a read which is not an obvious or necessary reading, but in Yishmael showing up, which we often read just as a moment of reconciliation or reconnection with Yishmael and Yitzchak, or with Yishmael and Avraham, but he adds the layer that it's sort of Yishmael showing up to Avraham's burial alongside Sarah is a way of Yishmael acknowledging, maybe not validating or agreeing with, but at least bearing witness to that sort of pride of place in Sarah's relationship with Abraham. Again, a person could obviously show up to a funeral without, supporting whatever relationship is being expressed there. But Rav Meidan adds that dimension. Okay, let me pause here for a moment, because then we go on a little bit more to the additional generations and then to more about the sale. I elaborated and extended a bunch on some of what we saw, happy to pause if anyone has questions or comments. David?
So in the beginning, where it talked about the midrash, where Avraham is offered to become the nasi, or the melech,
Mm-hmm.
and then the following paragraph talks about the concern of the people that Avraham will use his ownership of the land as a route to citizenship. Of course, we know that in places like Canada, that's official government policy. If you invest a certain amount of money in land, you do get to have citizenship.
Interesting.
Or that by allowing him to purchase a place that would be large enough, that would be a family plot, as it were,
Mm-hmm.
that there would be excessive attachment. And I'm surprised that Rav Meidan quoted the Midrash, which was unnecessary, and then goes on to quote these two perspectives that seem in conflict with that.
Mm-hmm. Right, meaning how could they be trying to prevent a foothold in the land for someone that they would have been willing to coronate as their king? Yeah, great question. I don't have any obvious answer to that question. I think well noticed. And yeah,
if I can answer my own question.
Yes, please.
So perhaps actually what they want here is a regent, that he's not actually that. Rav Meidan is careful, perhaps I'm overly reading it more, that Malchut is supposed to be about authority and power. He doesn't say that they're actually asking him to become the Melech.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe that's too much.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And then I'll just make a comment and wonder whether Harav, this is a really Harav kind of question, whether Harav Exler gives advice about dual headstones, because the reason that Hagar isn't married here is because Avraham has predeceased Keturah Hagar,
right?
And if I don't think we're told where Hagar is buried,
correct.
But it is really interesting family therapy stuff.
Yes. I haven't been consulted too often on those questions, and I would try to be reflective rather than advisory as much as possible. But yes, I just agreeing with the complex dynamics, and it's certainly it's not the case that, well, no, they're not alive anymore, so what difference does it make is resonates really with anyone, and under most circumstances. These things all carry tremendous meaning, and figuring out how to navigate that is really important. So well commented. I guess the last thing I would say, maybe on the question of that internal contradiction, Rav Meidan, maybe just going back up to it for a moment. Yeah, I'm only wondering whether it's sort of once he refused, then they said, okay, well, it might have been different if you were our leader, but now that you're not, then we're closing down any opportunity for you to have a foothold in the land. I'm not sure. Okay.
Stephen?
Yes.
It
James?
Does seem to kind of fold very quickly. If they're trying to prevent him from buying land, he just says, I insist, and they say, okay. And then on top of that, they sell him a very large piece of land, not just like a single plot. They sell him, 6 plots.
Right.
And the field.
Yeah. So it's a round or two. And Rav Meidan has a little more to say about it. Let's try to circle back to that question when we come to the end and see if we have any more insight. But I think you're right. We might have expected, if there is a more protracted negotiation and conflict, we don't see that much of it here. Okay. All right. So this takes us just to Avram and Sara and the next generation. Now Rav Meidan develops further. The cave was not just designated for the burial, or destined maybe for the burial of Avram and Sara. In the future, also their children Yitzchak and Yaakov and their wives would be buried there. The cave thus expresses not just an eternal covenant between husband and wife, but the chain of generations, which is sort of takes hold in Hebron, and constitutes a, I forgot to look up this word tamru. I remember it from Rachel Mebakal Baneha, but I wanted to actually see a good translation. So hold on a second. Yes, a sign for the children of Yaakov going down to Egypt, that they have a place to return to. It seems that this is the reason that Yaakov goes on at such great length about it just moments before his death, and emphasizing the importance of his being buried in Marat HaMachpelah, chapter 49, ready again, as we read there initially in the beginning of this essay, charging his children, saying, I'm gonna die, bury me with my fathers in the Ma'ara, in the field of Ephron Achiti, etc., going through the generations that were buried there. So again, the emphasis there, not just on it being this family plot, but somehow being a kind of a hold in the land and something for the generations. With the passage of 210 years of exile, the 12 messengers of the children of Israel come back to their land. The first place is referring to the scouts. The first place that they arrive at is, as it says in the beginning of Parashat Shlach Lecha, Vayalu v'Negev, they came up to the land through the south. Vayavo ad Hebron, they came to Hebron. And Rashi comments there, they came to Hebron. Kalev alone went, rather, I actually didn't translate it accurately. It's they came up through the south, and third person masculine singular, and he came to Hebron. So does it is now just refer to the group in a collective singular, or somehow are we meant to understand that only one individual came to Hebron? So that's the midrashic hook that Rashi is picking up on. Kalev alone went there, and he prostrated himself on the burial ground of the ancestors. Right, the return to the land then kind of links itself anew, reconnects that chain. It's interesting. Rav Meidan usually, I feel like, will elaborate a little bit more on a midrash or on the kind of underpinnings of it, but I think he's just simply saying that's this. The meaning of Hebron is obvious because that's where Marat HaMachpelah is, and so the emphasis that Yaakov places on it, as they have left the land, is sort of the placeholder that this is where they're going to go to when they return to the land, and so all that background literally is set for this verse to make sense, and for this midrashic interpretation to make sense. And why Kalev alone, is an interesting question, but okay. So the return to the land connects that chain anew. Let's return to Abraham, whose deceased loved one is laid out before him, and he's insisting not to bury until he acquires this foothold in the land, this cave of Machpelah. Ephron arrives, and when he hears Abraham's request, and he, feels the unpleasantness, the unease of the fact that Sara, who has died, is there, is there waiting to be buried, he hastens, and this gets to James' point, he hastens to give Abraham the field and the cave as a gift, right? He wants to get it done, and even if it means a larger portion, he just he's compelled a little bit by the circumstances. Not someone coming, as I said before, when everybody is healthy and well, to look prospectively at burial possibilities. We're in the urgency and pain of the moment, right? So Ephron steps in, answers Abraham in the presence of the Bnei Chet, all coming into the gate of his city, and says, "No, my master, hear what I have to say. The field is given to you, the cave that's in it is given to you, in the presence of my people, it's given to you, and bury your dead." But Abraham still stubbornly refuses and insists to buy it fully, for full cost. Avraham bows before the people and says to Ephron in the presence of everybody, if you would just listen to me, I'm giving the money for the field, take it from me, and I'll bury my dead there. It's possible that Abraham is insisting about this just because of his kind of, again, generous heart and his unwillingness to benefit from anyone else's kindness. We see that from Abraham in other places, that he just, is both a generosity, a kindness, and a sort of streak of independence and self-sufficiency. But it seems that's one possibility. That's the efshar. Ach nireh, that's the alternative. But it seems like Abraham wants to anchor this purchase of the field for eternity, a gift which is given under pressure at a time when the deceased is right there in front of us, and the dignity and honor of the deceased is expressed by immediate burial. That could be a kind of a cause for a future claim that the gift was really only temporary. It was given for the need of the immediate mission, or it wasn't given with total clarity of thought because of the pressure. Ephron could claim that the right to return to his field and cave is really his. His agreement to accept all that money expresses a real sale with full heart and a real sale for eternity. Now, again, we could come back and say maybe it's the same thing when Abraham insists and says, I really want to sell it to you for full money. And if Rav Meidan's claim is correct, that Avram's underlying motivation is to prevent Ephron from being able to claim later, well, I was just doing it to help you in the moment. Maybe we could still say Ephron could try to argue that, but once the money changes hands, as Rav Meidan's point is, even if he says, well, I agreed to the sale because of the urgency of the moment, but a financial sale is a financial sale. The claim of agreeing in the urgency of the moment makes more sense. That could be something we could go back on or revisit when it's a gift, but when it's a sale, it's a sale. Again, not that we don't have the idea of a sale entered into under false pretenses or not clear communication in halacha, but it's harder here. Similar to this is the sale of the threshing floor of Ornan that was on Temple Mount to King David, in order that he could establish an altar there in the house of ages. Now we have the quote from First Chronicles chapter 21. The context here was that David, actually apropos Lance of our discussion last week, actually let me jump right over there because you'll notice that it begins in the chapter with, hold on, Vayamod Satan al Yisrael, Vayaset et David limnot et Yisrael. Satan arose against Israel and incited David to number Israel. So somehow, it's interesting, not even a conversation between Satan and God being recorded here, but somehow Satan, whatever that means, whatever that is, stood against Israel and incited. Maybe is there any kind of play, although the language, the sound is the same, although the letters are different between Satan and Vayaset, incited David to do a census. So David does a census. We know from the Torah that censuses carry danger associated with them. And indeed, he wasn't supposed to do it. He, gets in trouble. He says to God, I did wrong. I wasn't supposed to do the census. But then not God Hashem, but then God Gimel Dalid, the seer of David, comes and says that God has said, you're going to have to choose from one of these terrible punishments. David says, I don't want to fall into the hands of an army. I'll take the plague option. And God sends a plague, 70,000 men die. And God sends an angel against Yerushalayim, but then, says, hold on. And at that moment, the angel is standing by the threshing floor of Ornan the Yevusi. David sees it, and he says to God, okay, I did the wrong thing, but please rescue us. And the Malach tells God, the seer, to tell David to go set up an altar to the Lord on the threshing floor of Ornan the Yebusi. That's somehow going to be the atonement or the counteraction. So they see the angel, they go, David comes to Ornan, he bows low. David says, here we go. Now we're picking up from where Rav Medan was quoting. Give me, meaning sell me, the place of this threshing floor. I want to build an altar to the Lord on it. Same language, bechesef malei, full price, sell it to me. Right, that's for the proof that latate here doesn't mean to give, because you can't say give it to me for full price. Obviously, it implies sell it to me for full price. And this way, my understanding is the plague against the people will stop. Ornan says to David, take it. Interesting, so it feels like a flip of the usual. Latate usually feels like a gift, and lakachat usually means an acquisition. Here, contextually, it's the opposite. He says, just take it from me. You don't even have to buy it, and do what you want with it. Not only that, I'm going to give oxen as burnt offerings. I'm going to give threshing boards that you can use for wood. I'm going to give wheat for a meal offering. Hakol natati. It's all a gift. And David says to Ornan, no. I'm going to buy it at full price. I can't make a gift to God of something that belongs to you, or sacrifice a burnt offering that has cost me nothing. I'm going to pay 600 shekel of gold. And he does, and the plague stops. Okay, so we see the similarities. But Rav Medan's going to add this additional layer of similarity, which again, I think we don't always necessarily notice in the story. And here's what he's adding. Again, this is not far from the first time that this comparison between these two sales has been made, but I think Rav Medan is focusing in on this additional layer. There too, it's possible that the giving of the threshing floor to David could have been understood as a giving under duress, right out of the fear of the plague of pestilence. Ornan himself, or maybe one of his heirs in a future generation, might be liable to demand the return of the threshing floor to them. And so David insists in paying a full worthy price, and in so doing, securing, the change of ownership for eternity. And indeed, it seems that Ephron doesn't want to sell the field. Now that we've talked about that comparison, we go back again. And so he suggests an outrageous sum of money for the field, right? We actually know, now Rav Medan, good intertextual connection here, or resorting to another text. He says, we know the cost, we know the going rate for acquiring a field in the land of Canaan. It's familiar to us. In Vayikra 27, again, passage of some time, but in Vayikra 27, it says, if a person wants to, consecrate a field of their acquisition to God, meaning somehow dedicated to the temple in some way, it's worth, follows this, its produce, which is a zera chomer sorim. I'm not going to translate a measurement of some kind, at 50 shekel of silver, of kesef. This was a fixed rate, which actually didn't change regardless of how the quality of the field, whether greater or less. And so, even if Ephron's field were really, really good, the request seems very exaggerated, right? Ephron answers Abraham and says, my master, hear me, this land for 400 shekel between you and me, what is it? And bury your dead. So again, we could argue on this, but Rav Medan wants to sort of suggest we actually know something about the going rate. A field should cost 50 shekel. So suggesting 400 is this, absolute, outlandish charge, which was Ephron's last ditch effort at, he couldn't refuse. It's his last ditch effort at trying to dissuade with a high price. Avram is not, doesn't argue. He weighs out all the money and buys the field. it's praiseworthy for a deceased to be buried in a portion which was bought at full price. And in the footnote here, he just mentions this idea of this halacha, according to which there's an obligation to bury someone in a grave which belongs to them. He says is not brought in the Rambam or the Shulchan Aruch, but it is minhag Yisrael across the generations that person should own their own plot. What's the alternative? I don't know exactly, meaning that the community takes ownership and gives it, or it's not totally clear sort of what the alternative is, but sort of it has the echoes of sort of the arba minim. You have to own your own. You can't get it as a gift. You have to somehow have invested in it in some way. And he cites some halachic sources that reference it, even though it's not right. James mentions Hebrew Free Burial Association is an interesting question, right? So it's the minhag where possible. I don't know whether there is I'd be curious. I can ask Amy about it. I don't know whether there is a deed that actually transfers to the deceased or the family in the process or not. It's a very, very interesting question. But there is this idea of the significance, the praiseworthiness of being buried in a plot that you own. And so it was said about Yosef HaTzadik, the bones of Yosef, which the children of Israel brought out of Egypt, they buried in Shechem, in this field which Yaakov had bought from the sons of Hamor, the father of Shechem, for 100 ksita. And this was an inheritance for the family of Yosef, right? So even there, maybe it was bought once, it can be bought on someone's behalf. I don't know if it needs to be within the family, how that works. By the way, Hebrew Free Burial is pretty much never totally free. So maybe part of what the minimal cost actually is to acquire the grave. I really don't know, but I will ask Amy. Let me show you one other thing before I wrap up for questions or further comments. This comes from Yoel Elitzor. It's straightforward Rashi Ramban, but I didn't remember having seen it until he notes it. Just a comment on the meaning of machpelah. So he says, when Avram says, I want, let him sell me the cave of Machpelah, Marata Machpelah. So the Ramban comments, close this so we can see it a little better. What is it? What is this Machpelah, right? So Rashi, the Ramban quotes Rashi, who says, Bait va'aliyah al gabav, where we hear in Machpelah the language of doubling, a house or a structure with a second story on top. Davar acher shekfula bezugot, or maybe it means something which is, it's doubled in pairs. I don't know whether that means that it has two pairs or that it's just arranged by pairs. I assume more the latter. It's a burial plot. It's a cave which is arranged in pairs. And this is apparently a Gemara which actually has two possibilities. One is, it's a machloket Rav and Shmuel. One says, a two-story cave. And the other says a cave with another cave inside it. And then the Gemara says, well, if it's a cave with another cave inside it, it's not really double. Double is one thing on top of another, but one thing inside another is not really double. So the answer to that is, okay, fine, not one thing inside another, but doubled in the sense of room for couples. Maybe that means side by side. Anyway, so before we see what the Ramban comments there, Rav Elitzor actually mentions, if I can quickly find it, he said, those in our time, I'm just reading free translating from his from the first page of his essay. It says, those in our time who were able to enter into the underground caverns of Marata Machpelah actually validated both the opinions of Rav and Shmuel together. In fact, underneath the monumental structure ground, which dates to the time of the Second Temple. There are two caves, which are one inside the other. And on top of them, there is an additional underground layer built, such that it actually is both opinions in the Gemara. Shnei batim zeh lifnim mizeh, one inside the other, or one further in than the other, and a structure with a house with another level on top. So the Gemara, and he says then the Gemara was actually, the Chachamim were actually in their interpretation of Machpelah, were basing themselves on a widespread tradition from the region which was known to people who lived there in previous times, and was, I guess, that knowledge and information was handed down. And there's lots of archaeological evidence to this kind of structure of underground burial sites. And so a fascinating little point. And just to conclude with that Ramban, so the Ramban quotes Rashi with these different readings of Machpelah, that it's either the structure, somehow dual or double structure of the plot, or it's that the plot was designated or set up for couples. Then the Ramban says, Einenu nachon, it's not right. Because the Pasuk later says, or earlier says, later says, the field of Ephron, which was in Machpelah. V'hinehu shem hamakom asher bo hasadeh. It was Machpelah is the name of the place that had the field, that had the cave in it. So it can't be a description. Marata Machpelah can't refer to something having to do with the structure of the cave. Machpelah was actually the name of the whole region that had a field, that had a cave and burial ground in it. And then he says, Ve'ein tzorech levakesh ta'am l'shem hamekomot. Kind of not anti-midrashic, but minimalist midrashic approach. It says we don't need to try to exegetically interpret the meaning of place names. It just means Machpelah is just a place name. And I actually don't know if he's Rav or Professor Elitzur goes on and says basically what the Ramban is saying is, so if you want to ask me why it's called Machpelah, I don't know. The same way I don't know what the word Lachish or Tziklag means. I don't even know what the word Yerushalayim means, and I don't even know what the word Hebron means. Don't try to understand what Machpelah means. It's a place name. So just interesting machloket, because I certainly remember always learning that Rashi about Machpelah, and it's just interesting to know the Ramban makes a good point, which is it seems to be a larger regional name, and names don't always have meanings or significances. It's the opposite of what Rav Avi always says, and I always say at namings. Names are more than just names. So the Ramban is saying sometimes names are just names. Any other thoughts, questions, comments on this?
Half the stories in Genesis are about how places get their names.
Yes, that's true. Okay, so sometimes names are, although it's interesting, yes, and sometimes I think there is a fair debate in the Torah about, in interpretation of the psukim in the Torah about the names of people, whether those are actually kind of folk etymological or really are the parental intention. Sometimes it is hard to tell, but we certainly do have place names that are given with explanation. So the Ramban, I don't think the Ramban is disputing that. He might just say, if we don't have the explanation, there might not be an explanation. But you're absolutely right to point out that it is clear that names are place names get their names, or often they're renamed, with intentionality. So
yeah.
Any other questions, comments, or thoughts? Dad, please.
Just as an aside, my Aunt Mary insisted that she had to buy her burial plot. She had to own that burial plot because she would not or could not be buried in what you refer to as in Yiddish, I don't speak Yiddish, a strange grave.
Yeah, that seems to resonate with this. Sort of tradition. I never really, Rav Meidan's footnote there was the first time I ever sort of thought about this question about, ownership. Is it a halachic issue? He sort of points out that it's not a deeply sourced halachic issue, but it seems to be a widespread custom and understanding, which I think this relates to.
Is it possible meant on a communal level, like a Jewish area?
Could be. Yeah. A very fertile topic and has significance, I think, for our own lived lives. And I think really, again, what stood out for me was the opening point about the double plot being part of Abraham's commitment to Sara and sort of the significance of that. And then this, additional layer of reading of the sort of political, geopolitical kind of underpinnings of the conversation between Abraham and Ephron and other places where we see that play out. So little more context for Marat HaMachpelah. All right. Dad?
So it seems odd to me that we're talking about this burial place as an eternal covenant. And after Yaakov, as far as I know, no one else is buried there.
Right.
The place where Jews are buried is Har HaZeitim, the
Right.
Mount of Olives. So it seems that David's purchase may be closer to where this eternal covenant ends up.
Interesting. Right. It's an interesting point. And, I mean, Avram he didn't have enough real estate to get something so big. But yeah, it is interesting that the chain stops there. What does that symbolize? It's a good point. All right. Yeah, David L., go for it.
I think it's predictable that Abraham is not going to take the gift after he doesn't take the booty.
Yep.
Right. But if Rav Meidan were here with us, one might, and I would, want to ask him about purchasing land that has been promised to Abraham by God. Why does Abraham feel the need to purchase the land from the inhabitants?
Right. Yeah.
Which sort of runs against the first Rashi in the Chumash.
Right. It's interesting. I've recently come across various debates, and actually it was in the wake of these elections, a lot of discussion on Facebook, obviously, as there always is about everything, about this sort of rhetorical language of the religious Zionist party, like the Baal Habayit has returned, and and sort of discussion about what is that appropriate language, and is there ba'alut, do we even have ownership over Eretz Yisrael? And it sparked a lot of debate, and people coming back to this Rashi, that first Rashi, as evidence. And the always back and forth about that Rashi is, on the one hand, it asserts God having given the land. On the other hand, it still points to the fact that is a contingent covenant. Now that covenant is contingent on our behavior, not sort of on our purchase. But I think it still opens up the possibility of readings that say, the land was promised to us, but we still had to do the various things you have to do to acquire land, conquer, purchase, whatever it is. But yeah, a very fruitful question, very interesting question. How did Abraham think about that? I mean, it certainly goes all the way on, as we were doing in Yossi Klein Halevi, with this, all the debates and discussion about the purchase of land in the modern Zionist era. That's certainly that was considered to be necessary, in the last 100+ years, 130 years. And so it's interesting Avram saw it as necessary as well, and a question I'd love to hear Rav Meidan's take on also. Thank you. Yasher Koach, everybody. Nice to have a shorter one so we could elaborate and discuss some more. I got to keep that in mind. Good night to all. Love to all. Mom and Dad. Take care.
Thank you very much.
Bye.